Welcome everyone. My name is Egon Sonnenschein, and as both a Holocaust survivor and a Yad Vashem benefactor, I was given the honor to introduce the lecture, the title of which is Pius XII and the Holocaust. What can we learn from the Vatican archives? My decision to become a Yad Vashem benefactor was taken not just because I am a Holocaust survivor, but because Yad Vashem, as the authentic voice of the both victims and survivors, strives to help to make the world a better place through Holocaust and remembrance and education globally, and thereby emphasize the crucial role of moral values and decision-making at all levels of society. Particularly given what recently happened in the States, one sees how vital Holocaust education is. Yad Vashem is training thousands of educators from around the globe, who each in turn educates thousands of students over the span of their career, means that these Yad Vashem trained educators are on the front line of the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, bigotry, and help make the world a better and safer place for humanity. I was born in 1930 into Slovenia, former Yugoslavia, and I was 10 years old when the war started. My family fled to Croatia, which became later a puppet Nazi state run by the brutal Ustashis, whose cruelty was on par with the most abominable regimes of the past. Victims of the Ustashis' sadistic rule were impaled, knifed, burned alive, or sometimes tied together and then drowned. The brutality and murder eyewitness remain ingrained in my memory to this day. The Croatian Ustashi were mainly Catholics. Yet the Catholic Church at the time did not publicly denounce the atrocity committed by so many of their parishioners. Fortunately, in 1942, my immediate family made our way to Italian-occupied Slovenia with false identity documents. I was interned as a civilian refugee of the war in Italy, before finally finding refuge with a foster family in Switzerland in 1943. I was only reunited with my family in 1945. On our return to Yugoslavia, we found that half of my father's and all of my mother's family were murdered, except for my 3-year-old cousin, Aviva, who was saved by a Muslim family by the name of Prohic. 4 of their family members were posthumously awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. We adopted Aviva. In 1949, we left communist Yugoslavia, lived in Israel for 7 years, and after that in South Africa, 26 years. In 1983, we immigrated to Australia. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Iael Nidam-Orvieto. She was born in Rome and is fluent in several languages. She is the director of the International Institute for Holocaust Research in Yad Vashem and teaches at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Previously, Dr. Nidam-Orvieto was editor-in-chief of the publication department of Yad Vashem. She received her PhD in Holocaust Studies at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has published in her main fields of research: Italian Jews during the Holocaust, Jewish responses during the Holocaust, Jewish leadership, the Vatican and the Holocaust, and the rescue attempt during the Holocaust. She was a research fellow in many countries and the recipient of several prizes and grants of institutions. It gives me great pleasure to call on Dr. Nidam-Orvieto to deliver the lecture.
So I would like, first of all, to thank again Mr. Sonnenschein. That it's a great honor to me and not the opposite. So thank you so much for your kind words. I would like to, I will share kind of a PowerPoint that will help us maybe pondering together. This lecture is not going to be a lecture of answers, not at all, because actually the opening of the archives of the Vatican are opening a new era and are opening a new period of research, intense research that will take probably several years to understanding this very, very complex topic of Pope Pius XII and the Holocaust, the Vatican and the Holocaust. Of course, this is an extremely controversial topic that is splitting public opinions and also scholar opinions on this topic. And we are all full of hope that we will start now a new period. Of course, as we know, a few days after the opening, the official opening of the archives, COVID-19 caused a total closure for a very long time, and now only in the last a few years or weeks we can see a reopening of different things in Rome, and also of the archives. And so scholars only from, of course, from Italy at the moment are able to go back and start analyzing and opening the files. And of course, it will take a very long time. Many of you, for sure, followed a month ago or so several publications on the media about the initial findings from the archives. At the time when I was being asked, I said, let's be cautious. We need much more time to analyze. This is only the beginning. We are not able, even when we find an amazing document, which is extremely important, that one single document or a number of documents cannot be sufficient for us to grab an entire picture. So therefore, we have to be patient, and we have to wait for a little bit longer in order to grab a vaster understanding of this topic. Allow me, please, to share with you one second. I will. Okay. So one of the problems when we cope with this topic of Pope Pius XII and the Holocaust, the Vatican and the Holocaust, is that the problems around this topic creates quite often a search for very simplistic understanding and very simplistic explanation of this topic. And that's why, for example, often we have this very sharp dichotomy between the good Pope and the bad Pope. The good Pope being Achille Ratti, Pius XI, the bad Pope being Eugenio Pacelli, Pius XII. There is a lot also in the literature, even today, that want to create this quite clear a division between the two popes, a division that, of course, is far from being exact. And therefore, I would suggest, and that's why I put a questioning mark, the good Pope, the bad Pope. We are not trying to give such kind of marks, and I think that this dichotomy creates only more misunderstanding in such a complicated picture like what we have. Now, when we think about the question of what can the new documentation add to our understanding, right? To our knowledge of the topic, this is a very difficult question because we know pretty much, right? We know, for example, that Pope Pius XII never clearly, openly, unambiguously, let's say, spoke about the killing of the Jews. He never mentioned the Jews. He never condemned directly the killing of the Jews by Nazi Germany. So the lack of this terminology is extremely important and is extremely clear when we deal with public speeches and public documentation. So often there is this question of, so what can we learn? What new insights can we have? And I think that if we think about whatever picture, and forgive me for the picture that I took that maybe is not clear enough, but if we to take a picture, okay? This is a part of a picture that doesn't really tell us much, but if we will add another part of the picture, then we will see some German soldiers, some people in the back. It starts giving us much more insights into what is the picture. And this is the picture. So when we have all the parts, then we can really understand much more. Now, of course, also this picture is also only partial, because I could actually, a picture is only the frame of the person that took the picture. I could actually enlarge more and more and more, and of course, receiving more and more understanding of what was behind, before, after, etc., etc. And so I think that this is the main importance of our need as historians to gain more material, to have more access in order to understand better. I always talk about the huge puzzles of thousands and thousands of pieces, right? Now, I do not know how many pieces we'll be able to fill by the end of our work of years in the archives of the Vatican, but for sure we will be able to understand many more parts of these huge pictures. We will probably, even at the end of the process, we will still have unanswered questions. I'm not scared of unanswered questions, but I do believe that we will have much more of a comprehensive picture of at least several of the questions that bother us as historians in the past, in the present, and maybe still in the future. Now, when we think about what can we learn as new from the new documentation, of course, we can also ask, what do we know already? Which knowledge do we already know, right? And some of these questions are connected actually to the material of the papacy of Pius XI that was opened years ago, right? And that's definitely enable historians to understand much better different topics and different chapters of this so controversial issue. For example, the Concordat between the Vatican and Nazi Germany, that, as we know, and I'm not going to go so much in details about this, but we know that for years we didn't have a vast understanding to what brought to the Concordat between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. Moreover, and here we could talk about methodological issues with the photographs. This photograph that I brought you, it's a very famous one. Actually, this is the photograph that is presented quite often in order to point at Pacelli, that at the time was not even a pope. He was a Secretary of State of the Vatican, right? He was the one that signed the Concordat. And therefore, for years, people point at Pacelli as the one that actually wanted and signed the Concordat. The opening of the archival material of Pius XI, some years ago, enabled historians to better understanding the vaster context of the Concordat, what brought to the Concordat. And now we are able to understand that, first of all, it's not Pacelli per se, it's Pius XI as the Pope that created, that initiated a policy of foreign affairs of the Vatican. And we have to remember, this is a very important context. The Vatican that came into existence de jure only in 1929. This is a very important point, right? And the policy of Pius XI that searched for enlarging the international recognition, diplomatic recognition of the Vatican, right? This is a very important factor that can explain to us the road to the signing of a concordat with the Nazi Germany. Another aspect that is also very important in this context is the fact that that previously to Nazi race to power, this dialogue with Germany, with different lenders at the beginning, started already several years before Hitler came to power. So in 1930, we see the first steps in 1931. So when Hitler came to power, and of course Hitler had all the interest to sign a concordat with the Vatican, right? The need for the Vatican, the decision, according to the strategy, the policy of Pius XI, to sign the concordat with Nazi Germany, not because of because they were closed in the ideology or in the view in their views, but quite on the opposite, because of the fear that Nazi Germany would harm religious rights of Catholics in Nazi Germany. This is what speeded also the decision to sign the concordat with Nazi Germany. So this understanding of the context is extremely important. Of course, the bottom line remains the concordat gave legitimacy to Nazi Germany. This was a step that is still considered very complicated and very problematic. So this very point did not change, but I think that our richer understanding of this context enable us to better understand this question, for example. So this shows us how important it is to have much more access to many more documents in order to understand this picture. Another topic that is also more clear, let's put it this way, in the last few years is the question of the hidden encyclica. The hidden encyclica, of course, that is connected to the last months of Pius XI's life, when in the summer of 1938, he reaches the conclusion that something must be said more clearly against Nazi anti-Semitism and racism, and he therefore approaches a Jesuit, Lafarge, and asks him to work on a draft of an encyclica that is supposed to be called Humani Generis Unitas. And so during the summer of 1938, Lafarge with other Jesuits work on a draft, but this draft was never published. Draft or several drafts in different languages, it doesn't really matter, but the draft itself was never published into a official encyclica. And one of the questions that for several decades scholars pondered was why? Why wasn't it published after the death of Pius XI? So we are talking about beginning of 1939. Why Pius XII, Pacelli, decided not to publish the encyclica? And was it intentionally shelved by Pius XII for different reasons? And I believe that also the knowledge that we have today, that was found in several years, but for sure the new open archival material will spread new light into this question also. We realized that this draft that was written at the end of summer 1938 is a very problematic draft, because indeed it condemned Nazi anti-Semitism, but it also included some very severe, I would say, anti-Semitic perceptions, anti-Semitic statements. And therefore, this draft, as it was as a draft, was not ready at all to be published if Pius XI wanted to publish something clearly against anti-Semitism. So the draft is a mixture of anti-Judaism, a traditional anti-Judaic perception of the church, and of course also stands against Nazi Germany's anti-Semitism. The decision of Pius XII not to publish it, or maybe to use part of it, this chapter is still vastly unknown to us, and this is one of the questions that probably historians will look into now that the archival material is open, because we do know that the first encyclica published by Pius XII, Pacelli, in October 1939, so we are talking about a month, a little bit more than a month after World War II broke. So this is an extremely important encyclica. That was the first encyclica of the new Pope, Summi Pontificatus, right? Takes some of the issues from the draft of Humani Generi Unitas. It takes the very, and you can see it from the title, from the undertitle, on the unity of human society. And there, Pius XII emphasizes the fact that all humankind are one race, are one group, with the same natural rights, rights that only God can give, and no human kind can take away, right? So here he has one of the principles that quite clearly looks, at least from now, it looks like it took this principle from the draft of the Humani Generi Unitas, but it did not mention at all other aspects that were raised in those drafts that were never published. So it takes what it believes it's important to emphasize at the beginning of World War II, the emphasizing the unity of humankind and the need to perceive and to keep alive the human rights of all human beings, no matter which let's say stirpe, that is the word that we will meet again and again, which entity you belong to, which people you belong to, which religion, etc., etc. So this is something that in part we have discovered many more details about what's the history behind the hidden encyclica, but still I think we need to clarify more several aspects of what happened between February 1939 until October 1939. What was the tract and the draft of the encyclica went through until some of the point reached the first encyclica of Pius XII. This is still partially an open issue that for sure we will understand much better in the coming years. And then, of course, if we jump, because we don't have enough time to do a very systematic and methodic stop at every point, we will jump now to a very deep and basic question. When we talk about the public speeches of Pius XII during the Holocaust, right? And the question that also Mr. Sonnenschein earlier mentioned very, very correctly is about the clear condemnation. When I say clear, I mean using the word Jews as the victims and using the word Nazi Germany as perpetrators or the collaborators in other countries. It doesn't really matter, but when we talk about, when we look for a clear condemnation, we do not find it, right? For example, if I think about one of the first speeches that refer to somehow to this topic is the radio speech of December 1940, okay? 2 years before the very famous one that we will, in a minute, we will reach. But in December 1940, when Pius talks about the disaster and the calamity of the war and the suffering of so many innocent people, he says that he is comforted by the fact that the church people around the world are able to help, to assist. And he says, not less of a comfort, it is for us that we were able to support with both the moral and spiritual assistance from our representative and with the support of our donation, a high number of refugees, exiles, and immigrants, even among the non-Aryans. Now, from what I understand in the oral version of the speech, he didn't use the term non-Aryans, but he used the term of Semites. And somehow when they publish it a few months after the oral speech, they changed the term into non-Aryans. it doesn't really matter. He used either non-Aryans or Semites, right? He doesn't use the term Jews, right? Now, of course, some of the people, maybe those people that were in favor of the Jews, that were against Nazi Germany, read those sentences and they say, wow, the Pope is comforted by the fact that the church are able to help Jews, to assist Jews, right? But it is not enough clear. So people can also read it in a different way. If he had said, even among Jews, that would have been much, much more clear. And this indeed raises a very big question of the lack of using the term, the very clear term of Jews, right, as the victims. Now, it's really interesting because we have a testimony of a Jew, a refugee that came to Italy and in a ship. It's a very long story. The ship was in danger. They were brought eventually to Italy as refugees, put in an internment camp. And because of the deep distress of those refugees and the hunger and diseases, their situation was extremely harsh. And they were afraid that they would be sent back to Europe into the hands of the Germans. One of these refugees decided to go and speak with the Pope, to have an audience with the Pope. Maybe the Pope will be able to help them and to assist this group of refugees. And this young boy that was brought to the audience with the Pope, he recalled his experience immediately after he arrived to then Palestine, right, to the land of Israel, in 1944, when he actually succeeded to arrive to the land of Israel. He published in the Palestine Post, which is what developed into the Jerusalem Post later. He published his story, and later he published, a few years later, he published the entire memoir, and also there this story appears. And it tells about meeting the Pope. And he describes this meeting as a very warm meeting, a very, the feeling of solidarity was very emphasized in this recounting of it. And I brought here only a few sentences. The Pope passes from one person to the other. In the hall, there are also several Nazi officers, German officers at least. So you can only imagine the fear of this young boy standing next to German officers. And the Pope, when it's his turn to speak, right, the Pope start talking to him and asking him what is his problem, etc., etc. And then he says, but now for you, my son, you are a young Jew. I know what that means, and I hope you will always be proud to be a Jew. So he uses here the term Jew. And the Pope raises his voice that everybody in the hall can hear it clearly, which again, you can only imagine what fear it causes to the young Jewish boy, right? That others, the Germans, can hear that he is a Jew, right? But the Pope clearly wants them to hear, right? And then he says, my son, whether you are worthier than others, only the Lord knows. But believe me, you are at least as worthy as every other human being that lives on our earth. So this is a very interesting situation where the Pope chooses to use the word Jew. So that makes the question even more intriguing. So why in this case, in an audience, you are able to call a person a Jew, and in the radio speech, you are not able to do that. And of course, we reach also the very famous speech of 1942 of the Christmas one. And again, there we see that when we talk about the suffering and this horrible war that is causing so much suffering to millions and millions of innocent people, and what do we owe to these innocent people? To recreate a society based on charity and on Christian values, etc., etc., etc. And then he says, and we owe it to the hundreds of thousands of persons without any fault, on their part, sometimes only because of their nationality or stirpe. Here is the word that I said earlier, stirpe, that comes from Latin, stirpe Judeorum, that is often translated as race, right, or descent, right? So only because of their nationality or stirpe have been consigned to death or to a slow decline. And here we have historians, above all, Michael Feyer, who clearly says, well, actually here it is condemning a genocide, right? It is condemning a genocide, a killing of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are basically brought to their death because of nationality or race, right? So this is a condemnation, but again, the Jews are not mentioned here. So why is it that in this kind of speeches, we do not see this clarity? And this, that in the viewpoint of Michael Feyer, it has an explanation that is quite interesting, but I don't think that it's a final understanding. Michael Feyer mentions that probably he was not able here to mention the Jews as victims because already for over 2 years, Poles, Catholic Poles, have been killed by Nazi Germany from the beginning of the war. And the Poles, the Polish Catholics begged the Vatican for a period of time to condemn these killings, these massacres, this huge wave of violence against the Poles, the Catholic Poles. But from the Vatican, there was no clear condemnation, open, official condemnation. So Michael Feyer says, well, if we have to talk about a silence, we should start talking about the silence toward the killing of the Poles already from the beginning of the war. So when this speech came in 1942, according to Professor Feyer, he says if he had mentioned the Jews, then it could have been a problem, because it could have raised question from the side of the Poles saying, excuse me, but they were killing us, there was no clear condemnation, so why now condemning the killing of the Jews? That could have maybe been a reason. We do not know. We simply do not know. It is still an unanswered question that will need to be explored much more if it will be possible to understand, right? So the question is it silence or is it prudence? Is it the willing of avoid any deterioration even more of the situation of Catholics and of Jews and other victims of the war, right? So this question of mentioning the victims and mentioning the perpetrators, it becomes and still remains one of the pivotal points that we need to understand more clearly. And of course we have, we can, if we think about the unanswered question that we have, okay, so why didn't he publicly condemn deportations, right, and killing of Jews? Even when it arrives to Rome, right, the question of Rome and the deportation of the Jews in Rome in 1943 is still an extremely delicate question and chapter in this history, and this very long history between the Jews of Rome and the Church, the Catholic Church and the popes, right? So as Susan Zuccotti put it, and as in her very interesting book, under his very window, the Jews of Rome were deported from Rome, a few kilometers from the Vatican, and still there is no clear, open, public condemnation of the deportation. We do see in different publications the concern, but this concern again is lacking the very clear calling by names of the victims and the perpetrators. So this question is extremely important. I do not know if we will find the answers, but maybe the large amount of documentation will enable us to have more clarity around this question. And of course, from this question, there is another, even more general question: how can we explain the policy? How can we explain the decision not to publicly condemn? Do we have any ability to understand what was behind the scene? What was the reasoning for all the steps that were taken, right? So one of the questions that can be raised, of course, is, can we talk about neutrality at all costs, right? And this is a question that has been raised for many years, right? The will of the Vatican to be neutral in the war, but at what cost? As Professor David Bankir of blessed memory one mentioned, is the question of, did the Vatican, did the Pope ever reach the point of enough is enough? Neutrality cannot be kept anymore because of the unprecedented crime that is being committed, right? So did they reach this point, or did they continue with neutrality at all costs? Which raises, of course, the question of, and several historians raised it, of an anachronistic response that did not fit the size of the disaster, the size of the crime that was being committed, right? In order to keep neutrality, neutral, you become anachronistic. You are not able to find the best choice and the best reaction. And many historians related to this, of course, Nicoli and others that mentioned about this aspect, right? So is that a moral failure? Some other historians and scholars ask. The very fact that the Pope was not able, the Vatican was not able to adopt a new strategy facing this crime, do we have to see it as a moral failure, as, for example, John Morley, the very famous historian, mentioned in his book, right? Are we facing a moral failure because of that? This is an extremely important question that, again, I'm not sure that we will able to gather a full picture and an answer as such, but I always believe that it's more important to ask questions than to raise final answers in this regard. But the question is definitely a question that is there, exists, is still pending, and we have to see if anything, any clarity can be created. And of course, there is another possibility also connected to this neutrality at all costs, which is connected to internal Christian interests, maybe to internal Christian problems, right? As some historians refer to, Paul O'Shea and Michael Fayer also mentioned it, maybe the clear will to avoid an internal split of the Catholics around Europe due to the fact that European society, and not only European, was full of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was an integral part of the culture, they say. And therefore, if Pius XII of the Vatican would have created a moral dilemma, whether to choose the side of a clear condemnation or the collaboration, or let's say a lack of a condemnation of what was going on, if the individual Catholic had to choose between two clear ways that were opposite, save Jews or not save Jews, collaborate with the Nazis or not collaborate with the Nazis, right? Condemning what was being done or not condemning, and keep sleeping quietly at night, right? If the Vatican and the Pope created such a moral dilemma for the individual Catholic, maybe the fear of a split, of an internal split of Catholics that would just decide to go on the side of Nazi Germany and their collaborators versus the morality, the moral choice of condemning. This is another explanation that is given by several historians that is still a tentative question, a tentative direction of thought that suggests a new need to check and to ponder, and of course based also on new documentation that can be found. So this is another question that we indeed will have to look more into it. Now, of course, there are also some scholars that suggested also years ago that the neutrality and the so-called silence or official silence must be analyzed within a different frame, a frame of the will of the Pope actually to rescue Jews. And this is one of the major answers that is given by scholars defending or trying to defending the policy of Pius XII, and they even call it a catacombal diplomacy. A catacombal diplomacy meaning that on the surface you keep neutrality, you keep silence, but behind the scenes you actually actively operate in defense of the Jews. Now, this is again an interesting question, but until today we do not have any footnotes. We do not have proofs that can prove this kind of direction, right? Because then if indeed there was a catacombal diplomacy, we would want to ask, so can we find a general instruction from the Pope? Let's say an instruction of the Pope to hide Jews in convents. Can we find a general instruction as such? Or was he expecting from local representatives to take initiatives? So if we analyze the first question, was there a general instruction from the Pope? The answer must be very, very clear, because we do know that even in Rome, even in Italy, and of course outside of Italy, we have many, many, many institutions, religious institutions that denied help, that closed their doors, that didn't accept opening, that did not want to get involved in rescuing Jews. So if there was a general instruction, we would imagine that every institutions, or at least the majority, would obey the order, right? So a general instructions, it is very harsh, I think, to prove such a thing, because the facts that are known prove actually otherwise, right? So maybe we are talking about instructions to some kinds of institution. We still don't have any proof to such a direction, right? So what is a catacombal diplomacy? To which direction can it be explained, right? When we ask ourselves about, was he expecting from local representatives to take initiatives, right? We have some hints that are already known for years, right? For example, the very interesting correspondence that the Pope had with the Archbishop von Preysing, right? And when he writes to him in April 1943, and he said, "We are grateful to you, venerable brother, for the clear and frank words which you have directed at your believers, and therefore also to the general public on various occasions." Of course, von Preysing was very, very active in phrasing in favor of Jews, right, and against the policy, the Nazi policy. So we leave it to the archbishops, active on the spot, to evaluate whether and to what degree it appears advisable to practice restraint ad maiora mala, vitanda, right? So in order to avoid worse consequences, right? In the face of the danger of reprisals and other pressures, in the case of Episcopal declarations, as well as other circumstances possibly occasioned by the length and psychology of the war. So here we have it. We leave it to the Archbishop active on the spot to evaluate. So is that the policy of the Pope, right? So this, if this is the case, if in the archival material we will find more hints and more proof to such a direction, then we will have to ask, is that a catacombal diplomacy? Because if I leave it in the hands of the local representative, then if the local representative will want to collaborate actively with Nazi Germany, then he will decide. So this is a very strong problem that we will have to face and see what in fact we can find in different places, in different countries, not only in Italy, but also in any other countries. And again, research that has been done on different countries do give some hints of direction, but we still are so much at the beginning of these questions and looking for information that it will take probably a very long time to answer those topics. And then from here, again, if connecting to catacombal diplomacy, but not necessarily, we have the question of what was his opinion of the Pope and the Vatican about rescuing Jews. And now here we have to cope with instances of religious superiors that initiated by themselves rescuing of Jews, and in some cases asked retroactively for permission, or in other cases asked maybe for assistance, right? And here the question is extremely interesting, whether the Vatican encouraged the assistance of Jews, yes or not. And again, we have only such fragmentary information that do not enable us to understand any of this very, very big question. For example, we have a postcard that was sent by Pius XII to the Mother General of the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary in 1943, in Christmas 1943. Now, this order was very active in rescuing Jews in Italy. So the Mother General was very open to talking about assisting Jews, right? And here she receives a postcard for Christmas from the Pope that states, Jesus gives himself to us unreservedly, in the poverty of Bethlehem, in the suffering of the cross, in the silence of the tabernacle, which is interesting that he uses the term silence. Would we have the courage to refuse him anything he asks of us for his poor suffering and abandoned brethren? Now, this is very interesting. Also, it says for his poor brethren, right? For Jesus' brethren that, of course, are Jews, right? So what is he saying here to the Mother General of an order that is involved in rescuing Jews? Now, the Mother General reads those sentences, and for her, this is a clear encouragement from the Pope of the rescuing of Jews. And therefore, she sends this postcard to all the institutions and says, you see, these are the words of the Pope that is encouraging us to enlarge our hearts and our assistance, right? But is this encouraging an encouragement? Is this a direct outcome of the initiative that comes from below, or is it something that comes from above, right? Is it only given upon a request, upon as a reaction to something that is already existing, or is it something that comes from above? All these are questions that will be, of course, answered, especially because we do have knowledge also of many cases, at least from what we know for sure in Rome, but in Italy and maybe in other places, we still vastly unknown, of requests from the Vatican of being prudent and actually reprehending sometimes people. I think about Father Benoit, but others also, of reprehending religious that were involved in rescuing of Jews, and from the Vatican they received a message that you're putting yourself in risk, and not only yourself, you have to be prudent, right? So does that go with the encouragement? There is a lot to be understood between those two sides, encouraging and requesting prudence and acting in these directions, right? So maybe if I want to get toward the end of our short talk, I would try to focus on the question of what can we learn, what can we know as new documentation is open, what can we gather more, which insights, right? I do not believe that we will find one document that will shock us, that will change our perception. I do not believe that we will gather a total picture that will change totally our previous perception. I do believe that the vast amount of documentation will enable us to feel a lot more of this puzzle that is very far away from being clear to us. And we will be able to gather better understanding of several points. So what will scholars look for? They will look for better understanding the internal dynamics of the Vatican, of the Church, the different and often contrasting voices inside the Vatican, the Curia, the cardinals, and then in other parts, if it's bishops in different countries, etc., etc. And the place, of course, of Pius XII vis-a-vis the different voices, vis-a-vis the different opinions of people that maybe were pro-Nazi, people that were in the middle, that people that actually were anti-Nazis and wanted to fight and wanted to defend Jews. And of course, the topic of Holland in this context will be becoming even more interesting to analyze, because when we will be able to analyze and understand the relationship between the center, the Vatican, and the periphery, which in the periphery can be inside Rome, inside Italy, and in other countries, when we will understand the relations, the connections, and the maybe instructions or lack of instructions, then we will better understand all these questions that are bothering us. And again, as I mentioned, the case of Holland, to me, it will become a very interesting case study, because we know that the episcopacy of Holland was extremely active against the Nazi invasion and against Nazi violation of rights, and also openly condemned the deportation of the Jews, the arrest and the deportation of the Jews. So here we will have to understand much better the connection and to see the responses. If we want to give an answer to the question whether he let the initiative in the hands of the local, then we have to ask, but what was the response? What was the feedback that the local representatives received from the Vatican, and how this encouraged, disencouraged them to continue operating in different directions? These are all questions that are vastly unanswered, right? And therefore, we will definitely need much more microhistory. The documentation in the archives will enable us to focus on different microhistories that will deal with a certain event, or with a certain country, with a certain correspondence between the Vatican and between a bishop or archbishop or a nuncio, whatever, there were nuncio still, or a diplomatic representative, right? Analyze the microhistory in order to create, that is exactly what it is, a puzzle. You take one little piece, but when you attach one piece to the other, then maybe you are able to understand the whole picture, or at least part of it, much better. So this is the strategy that we will have to start for years probably, to start with microhistory, to analyzing things that until now we were simply unable, analyzing different people in Rome, in the Vatican, around Pius. The name of the Lacqua was recently raised, right, as a person that had very clear anti-Jewish maybe a perception, right? So let's analyze it more. Let's understand certain people that were maybe more influential, maybe less influential for Pius XII, so that we can, step by step, arrive to an understanding of the much wider picture, because until now, we know certain things for clear. We know that it is an extremely complex and controversial issue and a figure, but we don't have enough understanding of all the parts around, of all the contexts, of different contexts that can explain different stories. Of course, Mr. Sonnenschein was mentioning Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia. This is an extremely important chapter because of the leadership there, because of the question of Stepinac. And lately, in the last few years, material was found in different archives that are suggesting new directions of thoughts about Stepinac, for example. So we need to understand. And in order to understand what was going there, we need the material. We need to see the correspondence, and we need to understand what happened there in Yugoslavia, in Croatia in this case, and in other countries. So this is exactly the kind of instances that it shows us how important it is to have a full disclosure of the material, so that we will able to start and deepen a honest, open understanding of this very, very complex and problematic topic of the Vatican and Pius XII during the Holocaust. Thank you. I promise you no answers. I promised you only questions. So here I gave you several important questions to ponder together. And maybe we will meet here in a few more years and we will have many more answers. Who knows? Let's hope so.
Thank you, Iael. So there were several questions, but one of the questions that came up was, that I read in the chats, was that whether in your planned research into the Vatican archives, do you expect full cooperation, even if the outcome would be not for the positive side of the Vatican?
Yeah. Okay. If I may answer, this is a very big question that I've been asked many times. I do believe that the Vatican, in this important decision to open the archives, and the Pope decision to open the archives, I think it reflects a point in understanding that closing and keeping the documentation does not help. It does not enable an open discussion that is extremely important in research, and not only in research. I know that there is much more than research here on the stage, but I think that there is a understanding that in order to cope with the past, you have to let it go, open, and let's sit around the table in the hope, on both sides there are extremists, in the hope that serious research will be done. Research that is not looking a priori for a condemnation or for defending, right? But a research that is based on the will to understand history, because only in this way we can really open also a dialogue, right? And I do believe that many scholars believe in that, and I think that the Vatican reached that moment and reached that point. So therefore, I do believe in collaboration. It's not going, I'm not naive, it's not going to be easy. And still, as I mentioned earlier, there are different voices. There will always be different voices. I want to believe that the voices that are going to a direction of opening and honest discussion will lead this direction, but only time will see, of course.
Thank you. Another question that came up in the chat that I was asked was regarding righteous among the nation and the percentage within the Vatican / Catholic Church. Could you remark on that?
Well, we know that among the righteous among the nation, and not only among righteous among the nation, because we have to remember that righteous among the nation do not represent all the people that were involved with rescuing Jews. We have to clarify this. But even that, we know that many of the rescue activity in different countries still, we have a very important research that is being done currently on France. There is some very important research that has been done by Sister Grazia Loparco in Italy and others, very important research. We know that many religious and clerics of different levels were involved actively in rescuing Jews, right? The question, of course, is whether it is an initiative that comes from below, or there is some kind of instructions, right? These are the questions. And we know also that, by the way, that people from other religions, pastors and et cetera, were involved in rescue, right? Not everywhere, and not the majority, right? So these are the questions that we have to ponder more, because one of the questions that I looked being written in the chat, I don't remember when, was did Catholic wait for a clear instruction? This is exactly connected to this question. Was an instruction, a clear instruction to assist Jews, to condemn deportation, etc., could have this helped initiating more rescue of Jews? You know, in history, it's hard to give answers to such a question, but there is no doubt that it would help. It would not maybe help those that were convinced that they want to collaborate with killing of Jews, and they would not necessarily change the view of those that were already convinced that they want to rescue Jews. But what about the rest, which is the majority of the population in Europe? So is it, according to what I mentioned earlier, an understanding that this vast majority, there is so much anti-Semitism there that if you will tell them rescue Jews, you will bring them to a split, or not? Or maybe it's some other idea. Definitely saying very clearly, denouncing very clearly the killing of Jews would have bring a shake to the conscience of, I don't know how many, but many other would have been maybe influenced and change their strategy of reaction. Again, you can't really answer, but you can ponder about it.
Dr. Nidam, my dear friend, you've raised many questions. I hope that over time and in your research, you will find some answer to these very interesting and questions that need to be answered. And I will pass on it to my dear friend and partner of Yad Vashem, Egon Sonnenschein, please, for ending words. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Nidam-Orvieto on behalf of all of us for a fascinating and very much passionate presentation. Clearly, there are many unsolved questions, and we hope that with more archival research, we will be able to understand the topic in greater depth. We are looking forward to hearing from Dr. Nidam-Orvieto, a follow-up lecture in the near future, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All the very best. Thank you for joining us.